In the 1970s, if you wanted to open a funeral home in certain parts of New York City, you needed permission. Not from the city, not from the state licensing board, from the mob. The relationship between organized crime and the American funeral industry is one of the least documented and most surprising chapters in the history of both institutions. It is not ancient history. It is not confined to one city or one family. And the reasons the mob was drawn to the funeral business reveal something important about how this industry works and why it has always been vulnerable to exploitation. Today we're going to talk about that history, the families involved, the schemes they ran, and what happened when investigators finally started pulling on the threads. To understand why organized crime was interested in funeral homes, you need to understand what makes the funeral business attractive to people who operate outside the law: cash, lots of it, paid immediately, by people who are not in a position to ask too many questions. When a family comes to a funeral home in grief, they pay. They pay for the casket, the service, the transportation, the death certificates. They pay thousands of dollars, often in cash, at a moment when they are least equipped to scrutinize the invoice. That cash flow, predictable, immediate, and handled by grieving people unlikely to complain, is exactly what organized crime looks for in a legitimate business front. But the mob's interest in funeral homes went beyond simple money laundering. Funeral homes provided cover for other activities. The hearses and vehicles used to transport bodies provided a plausible explanation for movement of people and goods that might otherwise attract attention. The embalming rooms and cold storage facilities provided spaces that were rarely inspected and almost never visited by outsiders. And the industry's culture of privacy, the discretion that is genuinely appropriate in dealing with grieving families, made it easy to operate without scrutiny. The Gambino crime family's involvement in the funeral industry in New York became one of the most documented cases of mob infiltration of a legitimate business sector. Investigators found that mob-connected individuals had ownership stakes in multiple funeral homes across the New York metropolitan area. These businesses were used to launder money from other criminal enterprises, moving cash through the funeral homes' books as legitimate revenue from services rendered. Some of the funeral homes provided real services to real families. The money laundering happened alongside the legitimate business, which is, in fact, how most mob front operations work. You run a real business. You just also run cash through it. In New Jersey, investigators documented similar patterns. Funeral homes connected to organized crime figures provided services to mob-affiliated families, and in some cases to mob victims. The funerals of organized crime figures became elaborate productions managed by funeral homes with their own connections to the same world. There is a dark irony in this that is not lost on investigators who work these cases. The same organizations responsible for some of the deaths being handled were also, in some cases, profiting from the funerals. But the mob's involvement in the funeral industry wasn't limited to the Northeast. In Chicago, investigators found connections between organized crime and several funeral homes on the city's south and west sides. In Las Vegas, the intersection of mob money and the funeral business followed the same patterns that defined organized crime's involvement in the casino industry: legitimate businesses used to clean illegitimate cash. In each market, the pattern was similar. A mob-connected investor would take a stake in a funeral home, sometimes openly as an owner, sometimes through a relative or associate as a front. The business would operate normally. The cash flow would be manipulated to absorb money from other sources. The investigations that eventually exposed these connections came from multiple directions. IRS investigators following financial irregularities, FBI agents working organized crime cases who noticed funeral home connections in the financial records of targets, state licensing boards that received complaints about specific businesses. What they found consistently was that the funeral industry's light regulatory touch made it an ideal environment for these schemes. The inspections were infrequent, The financial oversight was minimal. The cash nature of the business made it easy to manipulate records. And the industry's reputation for discretion meant that employees who noticed irregularities were often reluctant to come forward. Beyond money laundering, investigators documented cases where mob-connected funeral homes were involved in more direct criminal activity. In several documented cases, funeral homes with organized crime connections were found to have engaged in the same kinds of body part sales and remains mishandling that we've covered in previous episodes of this series. The difference was the intentionality. Where other cases involved negligence or greed by individual operators, the organized crime cases involved deliberate, systematic exploitation of the same vulnerabilities. Bodies that families believed had been cremated were, in some cases, used for purposes the families never knew about. The proceeds went into the same cash flow that was being laundered through the business. I want to be careful here about something. The documented cases of direct mob involvement in funeral homes are real and verified, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that every funeral home in New York or Chicago or Las Vegas had mob connections. The vast majority did not. What the mob's involvement illustrates is something more systemic: the funeral industry's structural vulnerabilities, the cash handling, the minimal oversight, the culture of privacy, the grieving customers who are unlikely to scrutinize their bills. These vulnerabilities didn't go away when the mob was pushed out of the funeral business. They just created opportunities for a different kind of exploitation, the kind we've been documenting throughout this series. The decline of organized crime's direct involvement in funeral homes tracked the broader decline of traditional organized crime structures in America through the 1980s and 1990s. Federal prosecutions, RICO statutes, and the breakup of traditional crime families reduced the mob's footprint across many legitimate industries. But the lessons the mob understood about the funeral business, the cash flow, the grieving customers, the minimal oversight, those lessons weren't forgotten. They were just applied by different people: the private equity firms that have consolidated the funeral industry, the predatory operators who take prepaid money and disappear, the body brokers who exploit donation consent forms. They don't have mob connections, but they understood the same vulnerabilities. There's one more dimension of the mob funeral industry connection that I think is worth discussing, because it gets less attention than the financial crimes. In several documented cases, funeral homes with organized crime connections were used to handle the bodies of murder victims, including in some cases victims of the same criminal organizations that owned or controlled the funeral home. This is not speculation. It appears in federal indictments and court records. Think about what that means. A family brings the body of their loved one, someone who was killed, to a funeral home. They don't know that the people who arranged the funeral have a connection to the people who arranged the murder. The grief and the crime intersect in the most intimate possible way, and the family never knows. Federal prosecutors who worked organized crime cases involving funeral homes have described this as one of the most disturbing aspects of their investigations. Not the money laundering, that's almost clinical by comparison, but the way the funeral home became a place where the mob's victims were processed, managed, and buried. The intimacy of it, the violation of something that should be sacred. The organized crime era of the funeral industry is largely over. The specific families and individuals involved have been prosecuted, aged out, or pushed out by law enforcement pressure. But the story matters for what it reveals. Every vulnerability that organized crime exploited in the funeral industry still exists today. The cash handling, the grieving customers, the minimal regulation, the culture of privacy that discourages scrutiny. The mob saw these vulnerabilities and took advantage of them, so have others, with different names and different methods, but the same fundamental exploitation of people at their most vulnerable. That's what this series is about. Not just the specific scandals, but the system that keeps producing them. Next week on Coffin Ledger, we're looking at green burial, the eco-friendly death care movement that promises a return to nature, and the fraud cases that have emerged as the industry has grown. Subscribe, share this. Every industry has a coffin. We track what killed them. This is Coffin Ledger.